Picture this: a wooden ship, maybe 60 feet long, creaking through the North Atlantic in January. The wind is screaming at 40 knots. Ice is forming on the rigging so fast that the ropes are doubling in thickness overnight. The deck is slick with frozen spray. And below deck, 40 men are crammed into a space the size of a modern studio apartment, shivering in soaked wool, eating salt pork that's been in the barrel since last summer. Now zoom out. Imagine a map of the Atlantic Ocean, sometime around 1680. Trace the trade routes with your finger. You've got the warm triangle down south, the Caribbean, the African coast, the familiar waters where most pirate stories take place. But now, look north. Follow the coastline up past the Carolinas, past New England, past Nova Scotia, all the way to Newfoundland. Now cut east across to the British Isles, then sweep down past the Bay of Biscay into the Mediterranean. Pirates sailed all of these waters, not just the warm ones, all of them. And some of the most feared pirates in history operated primarily in waters where winter could kill you faster than any Royal Navy frigate. The question nobody really asks about piracy is this: how did they survive the cold? Because everything we think we know about pirates is set in sunshine, blue water, tropical ports. But the reality was that piracy was a year-round profession, and for a significant portion of the year, the ocean was trying to freeze these men to death. So how did crews of outlaws, with no government backing, no supply chain, no proper clothing, and no reliable shelter, manage to keep themselves alive through months of brutal, bone-deep cold on the open Atlantic? The answer involves some ingenuity, a lot of suffering, and a few solutions so desperate they make you wonder why anyone chose this life at all. To understand why winter was such a nightmare for pirates, you first need to understand what these ships actually were. Because Hollywood has given us this image of the pirate vessel as something grand. A towering galleon with rows of cannons and a massive captain's quarters with a desk and a globe, and maybe a parrot. The reality was far less glamorous. Most pirate ships in the Golden Age, roughly 1650 to 1730, were stolen merchant vessels. Sloops, brigantines, occasionally a larger frigate if they got lucky. These ships were built for carrying cargo, not for crew comfort. The hull was thin by modern standards, usually just a few inches of oak or pine planking between you and the Atlantic Ocean. There was no insulation, no heating system, no sealed compartments designed to keep warmth in. Below deck, where the crew slept and ate, the ceiling was often so low you couldn't stand up straight. The space was dark, damp, and poorly ventilated. In warm weather, this was merely unpleasant. In winter, it became a freezer. Seawater would seep through the planking. Condensation from the crew's own breath would collect on the beams overhead and drip back down on them. Everything was wet, and when the temperature dropped below freezing, that wetness became a serious threat to survival. The ship itself would change in winter. Wood contracts in the cold, and the caulking between the planks, usually a mixture of oakum and tar, would shrink and crack. This meant leaks, constant leaks. The bilge pumps had to be worked around the clock in severe weather, and the water pooling in the lowest parts of the hull would freeze into sheets of ice that had to be chipped away with axes and hammers. Up on deck, things were even worse. The rigging, all those ropes and lines that controlled the sails, would ice over. A frozen rope is essentially useless. You can't grip it, you can't tie it, you can't adjust it without first breaking the ice off. Sailors had to climb the masts in freezing conditions, sometimes in the middle of storms, to hack ice off the yards and free the sails. Men fell, regularly. A fall from a mast in winter often meant landing on a deck as hard as concrete or going overboard into water cold enough to kill you in minutes. The sails themselves would freeze solid. Imagine trying to reef a sail, which means gathering it up and tying it to the yard when the canvas has the consistency of sheet metal. It took twice as many men and 3 times the effort. Fingers that were already numb from exposure would split and bleed from handling frozen canvas. Frostbite was common. Losing fingers was not unusual. And then there was the wind. North Atlantic winter storms could generate waves 30 feet high and sustained winds exceeding 50 knots. These weren't the brief tropical squalls that Caribbean pirates dealt with. These were systems that could last for days, pushing ships hundreds of miles off course and battering them relentlessly. A ship caught in one of these storms had almost no control over where it went. You lowered what sails you could, lashed the helm, and prayed. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. So with all of that, how did pirates actually manage the cold? The most basic answer is clothing, but even that was complicated. Pirates didn't have uniforms. They wore whatever they could steal, buy, or trade for. And the clothing available in the 17th and 18th centuries was not designed for extreme cold in the way modern winter gear is. The base layer for most sailors was wool. Wool has one massive advantage: it retains some of its insulating properties even when wet. And since everything on a ship was wet all the time, this mattered enormously. A pirate heading into northern waters would layer wool shirts, wool trousers, and woolen stockings as many layers deep as he could manage. Some accounts describe sailors wearing 3 or 4 shirts at once. Over the wool came whatever outer garment you could get your hands on. Leather jerkins were prized because they blocked wind. Heavy canvas coats, tarred or waxed to resist water, were common. The iconic tarpaulin jacket of the Age of Sail was essentially a canvas coat that had been soaked in tar or linseed oil to make it somewhat waterproof. It was stiff, heavy, and smelled terrible, but it kept the wind off your chest. For the head and hands, pirates used woolen caps, sometimes called Monmouth caps, which were thick knitted hats that could be pulled down over the ears. Mittens were preferred over gloves because they allowed fingers to share warmth, but they made working the rigging nearly impossible. Most sailors would alternate between bare hands and mittens, warming their fingers inside the mittens when they could and enduring the cold when they needed dexterity. Footwear was a serious problem. Most sailors went barefoot on deck even in moderate weather because wet leather boots on a rolling, pitching deck were a death sentence. You'd slip and go over the side. But in freezing conditions, barefoot was equally deadly. The compromise was often heavy wool stockings inside loose leather shoes or boots stuffed with whatever insulating material was available. Straw, dried grass, shredded cloth, anything that could trap air and create a barrier between skin and cold. But clothing only gets you so far when you're spending hours on a frozen deck in the middle of a gale. The real survival strategy was about managing exposure time. Pirate crews operated on a watch system, similar to naval vessels. The crew was divided into watches, typically 2, and they alternated between time on deck and time below. In winter, smart captains shortened the watches. Instead of 4 hours on deck followed by 4 hours below, you might see 2 hours on, 2 hours off. Some accounts mention even shorter rotations in extreme cold, with men spending just an hour topside before being relieved. Below deck, the crew's primary heat source was each other, body heat. In a confined space with 20 or 30 men packed together, the temperature could be significantly higher than the outside air. It wasn't comfortable. It was, by every account, absolutely miserable. The smell alone was legendary. Dozens of men who hadn't bathed in weeks, wearing damp wool, crammed into a space with no ventilation. But it was warm enough to keep you alive, and in a North Atlantic winter, that was the only standard that mattered. Some ships had small stoves or fireboxes. These were carefully contained fireplaces, usually made of brick or iron, designed to be used below deck without setting the ship ablaze. The risk of fire on a wooden vessel was so extreme that many captains forbade any open flame below deck entirely. But when the alternative was freezing to death, the rules got flexible. When a firebox was available, it served double duty. It heated the space, and it was used to prepare hot food and drink. Hot food was a genuine survival tool in winter sailing. A meal of hot porridge or heated stew could raise a man's core temperature enough to get him through his next watch on deck. The ship's cook, often one of the lowest-ranked men on board, became critically important in winter. A good cook who could produce hot meals consistently could literally mean the difference between a crew that functioned and one that fell apart. The primary hot drink was a mixture of water, rum, and whatever else was available. Sometimes this was heated wine, sometimes it was a crude grog made by mixing rum with hot water and a squeeze of lime. The alcohol was important, not because it actually warmed you, it doesn't. Alcohol causes vasodilation, which actually makes you lose heat faster, but because it numbed the pain and the misery enough to keep men working. Pirates drank enormous quantities of alcohol in winter. This wasn't recreation, it was self-medication. Food in general was a critical survival factor, and winter made an already bad situation worse. A pirate ship's provisions were famously terrible. Salt pork, salt beef, hardtack biscuits, dried peas, and whatever fresh food could be obtained in port, which lasted maybe a week before spoiling. In winter, fresh food was essentially unavailable. Ports were harder to reach, fishing was more dangerous, and even the salt provisions suffered. Salt pork stored in barrels could freeze solid, making it nearly impossible to portion out. Hardtack in damp conditions grew mold and attracted weevils, though many sailors simply ate the weevils as extra protein. The caloric demands of cold weather sailing were extreme. A man working the rigging in freezing conditions could burn upwards of 5,000 or 6,000 calories a day. The available food rarely provided even 3,000. This caloric deficit meant that crews grew weaker as winter progressed. Men lost weight rapidly. Their bodies consumed muscle mass for fuel. By late winter, a pirate crew that had been at sea for months might be barely functional, a collection of exhausted, malnourished, half-frozen men trying to sail a ship that was itself falling apart from the cold. Scurvy, the disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, was a year-round threat, but hit hardest in winter when fresh fruits and vegetables were completely unavailable. The symptoms started with fatigue and joint pain, progressed to bleeding gums and loose teeth, and could end in death if untreated. A ship with half its crew suffering from scurvy was in genuine danger of not having enough hands to sail. Hypothermia was the most immediate winter threat, and pirates understood it even if they didn't have a medical term for it. They recognized the stages. First came the violent shivering, then the confusion, then the sleepiness. An experienced crew knew that when a man stopped shivering and started acting drowsy, he was in serious trouble. The treatment was crude, but sometimes effective. Get the man below deck, strip off the wet clothing, wrap him in dry blankets if any existed, and pack other warm bodies around him. If rum was available, it was given, though as mentioned, this actually worked against recovery. If dry clothing existed, which was increasingly rare as winter dragged on, the man would be redressed and kept below until he recovered. Frostbite was almost as dangerous. Fingers, toes, ears, and noses were the most vulnerable. The early stages, what we now call frostnip, were so common that most sailors simply ignored them. It was only when the skin turned white and hard, indicating that tissue was actually freezing solid, that alarm was raised. Treatment options were limited. Warm water immersion was known to help, but clean warm water was a luxury on a pirate ship. More often, frostbitten extremities were simply left to thaw on their own, with predictably horrific results. Blackened, dead tissue would eventually rot and fall off or require amputation. The ship's surgeon, if one existed, might handle this. If not, the ship's carpenter, already skilled with saws and chisels, would do the job. Given all of this, you might wonder why any pirate would willingly sail in winter at all. The answer is complicated. Some had no choice. A pirate crew that had angered the authorities in their usual hunting grounds might be driven north by pursuing warships. Others were caught by the seasons. A ship that left port in late autumn, expecting a quick voyage, might find itself trapped by winter weather before it could return to warmer waters. But some pirates actively chose to operate in cold waters, and their reasons were both strategic and economic. The cold weather shipping routes carried extremely valuable cargo. Ships moving between northern Europe and the American colonies transported manufactured goods, textiles, tools, weapons, and luxury items that fetched high prices. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the Pirate Code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds. Grab it now. because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. The fishing fleets off Newfoundland and Iceland were seasonal gold mines. Cod, the single most traded commodity in the pre-industrial world, was harvested in enormous quantities during the cold months. A pirate who could intercept even one loaded fishing vessel or merchant ship in northern waters might take enough prize to set himself up for the entire year. There was also the element of surprise. Most merchant ships expected pirate attacks in warm waters. The Caribbean, the coast of Africa, the Indian Ocean, these were known danger zones. A merchant captain sailing from London to Boston in December wasn't typically thinking about pirates. His guard was down. His crew was focused on surviving the weather, not watching for black flags on the horizon. This made cold weather piracy potentially more profitable per encounter, even if it came at tremendous physical cost. The geographic factor mattered too. Pirates operating in the North Atlantic had access to a different set of hiding places than their Caribbean counterparts. The coastlines of Scotland, Ireland, Scandinavia, and the Canadian Maritimes were riddled with inlets, fjords, bays, and islands where a small ship could disappear. Many of these locations were so remote that naval patrols rarely visited them, especially in winter when even the Royal Navy preferred to keep its ships in port. Some of the most successful cold weather pirates had semi-permanent winter bases in these remote locations. These weren't the elaborate pirate havens of the Caribbean like Port Royal or Nassau. They were crude camps on uninhabited islands or hidden shorelines. A crew might beach their ship, set up tents, or build rough shelters from whatever materials were available and hunker down for the worst of the winter months. They'd hunt, fish through the ice, melt snow for fresh water, and repair their ship while waiting for conditions to improve enough to sail again. These winter camps were grim places. Imagine 40 or 50 men living in makeshift shelters made of sailcloth and driftwood, eating whatever game they could shoot and whatever fish they could catch, with no medical care, no resupply, and no guarantee that their ship would still be seaworthy come spring. Disease could sweep through a winter camp with devastating speed. Dysentery, typhus, and respiratory infections were common killers. A crew that entered winter camp with 50 men might emerge in spring with 30. But the alternatives were often worse. Continuing to sail through the worst winter storms was suicidal. Trying to reach a major port meant risking capture and hanging. And heading south to warmer waters wasn't always possible if you were wanted in those regions or if the wind and current simply wouldn't cooperate. There's another detail about these winter camps that rarely gets mentioned, and it's one of the more unsettling aspects of cold weather piracy: burial. When men died during winter camp, and they died regularly, the ground was often frozen too hard to dig a grave. Bodies would be stacked in a designated area away from camp and left until spring, when the earth softened enough to bury them. Or more commonly, they were simply weighted with rocks and dropped into the nearest body of water once the ice broke up. There was no ceremony. There was no time or energy for ceremony. A man who was alive yesterday was dead today and disposed of tomorrow, and the rest of the crew went back to the business of trying not to join him. The Vikings, who were essentially the original northern pirates, had centuries of cold weather sailing knowledge that later pirates benefited from indirectly. Norse shipbuilding techniques, navigational methods, and cold weather survival strategies had filtered down through generations of northern European maritime culture. A pirate crew sailing out of a Scottish or Irish port in the 1600s might include men whose grandfathers had been fishermen or whalers in the North Sea, men who grew up understanding cold water sailing in their bones. These inherited techniques included things like how to read ice conditions, how to predict storms from wind shifts and cloud patterns, how to identify sheltered anchorages by reading the shoreline, and how to manage a ship in heavy seas. A pirate captain operating in northern waters needed to be not just a fighter and a leader, but a genuinely skilled cold weather mariner. The ones who weren't skilled didn't last long. The sea took them. One of the more fascinating cold weather survival techniques was the use of animal fats. Seal blubber, whale oil, and rendered animal fat served multiple purposes. Rubbed on the skin, it provided a layer of insulation and some protection against wind and spray. Used to waterproof clothing, it could extend the useful life of a canvas coat or a pair of leather boots. Burned in a lamp, it provided light and modest heat below deck. And eaten directly, it was one of the most calorie-dense foods available, providing the energy a man's body desperately needed to maintain core temperature. Pirate crews that operated near seal colonies or whale migration routes would hunt these animals specifically for their fat. A single large seal could provide enough blubber to grease the skin of several men, waterproof a couple of jackets, and fuel a lamp for days. This wasn't the romantic image of piracy that most people carry in their heads. It was survival at its most basic and brutal. Another technique was the creation of windbreaks on deck. In heavy weather, canvas sheets or spare sails would be rigged across sections of the deck to create sheltered areas where men could stand watch without being fully exposed to the wind. These windbreaks didn't provide warmth, but they reduced wind chill dramatically. On a night when the air temperature was just above freezing, wind chill from a 30-knot gale could make the effective temperature feel 20 or 30 degrees colder. Cutting that wind made the difference between unpleasant and unsurvivable. Some crews built what they called kennels on deck, small enclosed structures made of spare planking and canvas where the helmsman and lookout could shelter while still performing their duties. These were crude, temporary structures that might last only a few weeks before the sea destroyed them, but they could save lives during the worst weather. Below deck, the arrangement of sleeping spaces mattered more than you might think. Hammocks were the standard sleeping arrangement for most sailors in this period, and they had genuine cold weather advantages. A hammock elevates you off the deck, which means you're not lying directly on the cold planking. The fabric wraps around you on both sides, reducing heat loss. And hammocks can be hung close together, allowing adjacent sleepers to share radiant heat. Some crews went further, rigging their hammocks in tiers and arranging them so that the warmest position, nearest the ceiling where heat rises, went to the men coming off watch who needed to warm up fastest. The coldest position, nearest the deck, went to those who had been below longest and had already recovered some warmth. This rotation of sleeping positions was a small thing, but in conditions where every degree of warmth mattered, small things added up. The psychological toll of winter sailing was arguably worse than the physical one. The cold, the darkness, the constant danger, the bad food, the sickness, and the monotony created conditions ripe for despair. Daylight hours in the North Atlantic in winter could be as few as 7 or 8. Men spent most of their time in near total darkness, either below deck or on deck under overcast skies. There's a reason that depression and what we'd now recognize as seasonal affective disorder were common among northern sailors. Pirate crews dealt with this in various ways. Alcohol was the most common coping mechanism, with all the problems that entailed. Music was another. Pirates were known for their singing, and not just as a stereotype. Songs served a practical purpose on sailing ships. They synchronized work like hauling lines and working the capstan, but in winter they also served as morale tools. A crew that was singing was a crew that was still functioning. Gambling was constant. Dice, cards, and various betting games helped pass the endless dark hours below deck. Some captains tried to regulate gambling because it led to fights, but in winter most were wise enough to allow it. A crew with something to argue about was a crew that was still engaged with life. Storytelling was perhaps the most important morale tool. Long winter nights below deck, with nothing to do and nowhere to go, were filled with stories. Tales of past prizes, of narrow escapes, of legendary pirates, of the fortunes waiting when spring came. These stories served the same function as the myths and legends of any isolated community. They reinforced group identity, they kept hope alive, and they passed the time. The relationship between captain and crew became particularly critical in winter. A pirate ship was, in theory, a democratic institution. The captain was elected and could be deposed. But in winter, the captain's ability to make good decisions about when to sail, when to shelter, when to ration food, and when to push the crew became a matter of life and death in a way that summer sailing rarely demanded. A captain who pushed his crew too hard in winter conditions risked losing men to exhaustion, frostbite, and falls. A captain who was too cautious risked running out of provisions while hiding in some remote bay. The best winter captains were pragmatists who understood that survival came first and profits second. The worst were either reckless or paralyzed by indecision, and both types got their crews killed. The quartermaster, the second in command elected by the crew, had an outsized role in winter. He controlled the distribution of food, rum, clothing, and other supplies. Fair distribution was always important on a pirate ship, but in winter it was absolutely critical. If men suspected that the quartermaster was favoring certain crew members with extra rations or warmer clothing, the result could be mutiny. And a mutiny on a ship in the middle of a North Atlantic winter was a death sentence for everyone involved. Some of the most dramatic episodes in pirate history took place during winter operations. Bartholomew Roberts, one of the most successful pirates of the Golden Age, lost several ships and dozens of men to winter storms off the coast of Newfoundland. Edward Lowe, a notoriously brutal pirate, was driven north by naval pursuit and spent a miserable winter in the waters around Nova Scotia, losing nearly half his crew to cold, disease, and desertion. Even Blackbeard, who is primarily associated with warm water piracy in the Carolinas and Caribbean, spent time in northern waters and was well aware of the challenges. His decision to accept a royal pardon in 1718 and settle in North Carolina was, among other things, a decision to stop fighting winter storms. The age of piracy eventually ended for many reasons, including increased naval patrols, international cooperation against piracy, and the reduction of lawless ports. But winter played its quiet role too. As piracy became harder, as the easy pickings disappeared, the cost-benefit calculation shifted. The misery of winter sailing was tolerable when the payoff was a fat Spanish galleon loaded with gold. It was considerably less tolerable when the best you could hope for was a merchant brig carrying timber and salted fish. The pirates who survived winters at sea were, in their own brutal way, some of the toughest human beings who ever lived. They endured conditions that would break most modern people in days, with nothing but wool clothing, salt pork, rum, and their own stubborn refusal to die. They weren't heroes. Many of them were murderers, thieves, and genuinely terrible people. But their ability to survive the cold ocean month after month, with almost no resources and no safety net, is a testament to human endurance that deserves recognition, even if the humans in question don't deserve admiration. The next time you see a pirate story set in crystal blue Caribbean waters, with the sun shining and the heroes wearing open-collared shirts, remember that the reality was often very different. Remember the frozen rigging and the ice-coated decks. Remember the frostbitten fingers and the half-starved crews. Remember the men huddled together in the dark, wreaking hold of a leaking ship, listening to the wind howl across a gray and frozen sea. That was piracy too, and in many ways, that was the piracy that mattered most. Because here's what separates the pirates who lived from the ones who didn't. It wasn't fighting skill, it wasn't cunning, it wasn't navigation or seamanship, though all of those helped. It was the willingness to endure conditions that no rational person would choose. It was waking up shivering in a frozen hammock, pulling on clothes that hadn't been dry in weeks, climbing onto a deck coated in ice, and doing the work anyway. Day after day, week after week, in darkness and cold and misery that most of us can't even imagine. Anyone can be dangerous when the sun is shining. It takes something else entirely to be dangerous when the ocean itself is trying to kill you.